All right, and welcome again to the Backyard Farming Small Ruminant series. This is the last of the Goat 911 for all this fall and winter 2023. My name is Megan Purdue. I am the ag agent in Worcester County for the University of Maryland Extension. This is Goat 911, or title in this, Catching Urgencies Before They Turn into Emergencies. All right, as always, we do have a few disclaimers. The advice in this presentation does not represent medical, veterinarian, or legal advice. Always seek competent veterinary advice when possible. Use of a website, whether it's product or brand, is not an endorsement. It's just usually what we have available or what somebody took a picture of. It is essential to have a veterinarian in the event of an emergency, especially now when they're in short supply and very, very busy. Generally, they're not going to talk to you unless you're already a client. This presentation is covering some of the common problems that may be encountered. Any illnesses that are listed under symptoms are possible causes. It's somewhere to get you started. An examination by your vet and further diagnostics are usually necessary to either rule out or confirm. All right, the first thing that we do need to understand, especially when we're talking about livestock, is that diagnostics can be difficult. There's some obvious things like a broken leg that you might be able to diagnose pretty easily, but when it comes to things like lethargy or just not, the animal's just not itself, then it can get a little difficult. And since they can't talk to us, that makes it even more difficult. So Dr. House is my example of this because he was always solving medical mysteries. And I have been a part of solving medical mysteries, both in this job and when I worked for a vet's office. And sometimes it takes several people discussing things to figure out what's going on. All right, remember a couple of things. It's never wrong to call your vet if you suspect or know you have an emergency, and usually the sooner the better. A lot of times what happens is people are afraid to call them because they're not sure they have an emergency. And usually that's kind of where I come in. People will call me all the time, whether it's personally because they know me personally or through work to see if they have an emergency. And that's fine too, unless time is of the essence. Especially if it's 3 o'clock on a Friday, you want to make sure you get a hold of your vet before they leave for the weekend. But you should feel comfortable, and that's kind of the purpose of this presentation, is to help you recognize things a little quicker and help you work with your vet better, and give you the confidence that you need to recognize the emergency and go ahead and call your vet. All right, so why are we doing this? With a lot of diagnostics or figuring out what's wrong with your animal, a good history is necessary. You need to know what the history is of the animal, what's happened recently, a lot of things. If you can provide a good history, it can reduce some of your costs for diagnostics. So a good example of that in the pet world is dogs ingesting marijuana, because nobody ever wants to admit to it, but the symptoms are pretty obvious to anybody who's worked with dogs long enough in the vet world, because they're pretty noticeable. But since people don't want to admit to it, the only other option is to run a whole bunch of diagnostics on that animal. Now, usually when an owner is faced with a couple $100 worth of diagnostics versus fluids, then they open up to you and you find out what actually happened. But that's just one example of why you would need a good history. And then it can save your vet valuable time. Vets are very busy. So if you can go ahead and provide that good history and at least rule out some things, then that's going to save them time. So the more information you can provide is always better. One thing that we had in the veterinary world, and you probably, if you saw the computer system that your vet has, this might be listed in there, is ADR. And ADR stands for ain't doing right. That was a real thing that we had in the computer system when an owner would come in and they're just like, I don't know what's going on with my animal. I want it checked out. We put in ADR. It is a legitimate reason to call a vet. You know your animals. If something's not right with them, you might not know what it is, but you need to get them seen so that somebody can figure it out. It does require a little bit more detective work. These are sometimes one of those situations where the vet and the techs are discussing the animal. They're all looking at the animal, trying to figure out what's going on, what next steps to take. But it is, if you suspect something is not right with that animal, then you do need to get it checked out. In some cases, they may end up just treating the symptoms. Um, and for you, if you're a novice, then this might be the only thing that you notice. You might not notice the little things that a vet or somebody with more experience would pick up, but you might notice that your animal's just not right. Now, this is a saying that I think I heard on Grey's Anatomy the first time, but apparently it's pretty common in the medical world, especially with human medicine. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And I added in there, unless you're in Africa, because John frequents Africa. So that might be the case if you're in Africa that you hear zebras. But you want to look at the most logical, what are the most logical things that could be wrong with your animal, and rule those out first. So if you have a kid that's lame, well, you're not going to be looking at illnesses that are common in a pregnant animal, for example. If you're out in the hot, dry desert, then parasites probably aren't going to be on your radar, versus here, you see an anemic animal, you go immediately to the barber pole worm, because that is the most likely thing that it is. So some other things to keep in mind is your animals do not read books. And I tell people my goats don't read books, and if they did, they would skip that chapter. This is mostly common at lambing and kidding, when everybody's expecting, because the book or the internet said that it should take this long, but my animal's taking longer, so I need to pull the kids. Well, I've seen a lot of people go in too early. Personally, I've been doing this a really long time, and I can tell you each animal is different. And they don't always do things the way the book says they should do. They don't always present with symptoms of a disease that they have the way the book says they should. So always keep that in mind. Every animal is going to be different, and it might not be exactly the way that you read that it should be. So again, you want to start with what is most likely based on their history. You want to take into consideration their history, their age, and the environment. So again, like here, barber pole worm, very big problem. If I was out in the hot, dry desert, wouldn't be as big of a problem. All right, so some of the things that you want to take note of when you're thinking of your animal's history, and these should be things that you should be ready to answer if you do take an animal to the vet. One of those, especially with livestock, is going to be management. So this can make us think, when you tell somebody your management, it's going to cause somebody like myself or a vet to think of different things. So we want to know high grain versus no grain is an important thing to know, because an animal on high grain is going to be at more risk for things than an animal that's on no grain. Confinement versus pasture. Are they dry lot or are they out on pasture? The life stage or the age of the animal. Are we looking at a lamb or a kid? Are we looking at a weanling, an adult? And then the stage of production. Is that animal pregnant? Is the female, is she pregnant? And if she is pregnant, is it early gestation or late gestation? Late gestation, there's going to be other problems that can happen to them that are more common in late gestation. So that was an important thing for the veterinarian to know. Is the animal lactating, or are they dry? Have they been exposed to a male? Or is the animal a breeding buck or a ram? Weathers would also be important. If you were calling into your vet, for example, it would be important for them to know if you're talking about a male, if you're talking about a wether or an intact male. Another part of the history is, has anything changed for the animal? Has your feed quantity or the type of feed, the source of feed, has that changed? Are you feeding a different hay? Did you go from a grass hay to a legume hay? Did you get some free hay from your neighbor and there might be some mold in it? Things of that nature. Have you gotten any new animals? Have you moved your animals? And then what have you done to the animals recently, if anything? Did you just give vaccines? If disbud your kids? Have you castrated the animal recently? Any of those management things that you may have done recently? Have you taken the animal to a show or off the farm recently? If you're looking at respiratory diseases, that is incredibly important. We did have a case down here where they took the animal to the vet. It was showing signs of pneumonia. The vet found out that it had been to a show. The vet had also seen several other animals that had been to that show as well. Were there any stressors recently? Did a predator get in there with your animals? Did a dog, whether it's your dog, the neighbor's dog, or a wild dog, get in there and scare or attack the animals? Did you just wean lambs or kids? And then another thing that, especially with grazing animals and ruminant animals, is how is the animal's appetite? And this is the one that always sticks with me when I ask people, which is why I bring it up a lot. And I fully explain what I mean now because I realize not everybody knows what I mean. So I want to know, if I'm asking you how the animal's appetite is, you tell me your animal's not acting right, might be sick. If I ask you about your animal's appetite, I want to know that that animal is eating as aggressively as it normally does. Picking at the food is a reduced appetite and is likely a sick animal. Some animals have such a great appetite that they will continue trying to eat, whereas other animals will go completely off feed. So you need to know, has that animal's appetite changed? So is it still grazing the same as it is, or does it walk out in the field and it just lay down and just pick at the grass? Is it eating hay like it used to or like it should? Is it eating grain? So if an animal's appetite is not normal, meaning it's eating less, not at all, or just not excited about the food, that's usually indicative of a problem. Some of the animals are going to be too lethargic to eat as much. So you see that a lot with the barber pole worm, where they're anemic and they're just too lethargic to really go out and eat. They'll still go out with the rest of the herd or the flock, but they'll just kind of lay there and eat what's around them versus get up and move with the rest of the flock. A lot of times a lack of appetite is indicative of an animal with a fever. So the first thing usually that I go for if I see an animal off feed, unless I know it has diarrhea, is I go for a thermometer. All right, how are the animals' eliminations? So again, is there a normal stool? So we're looking at sheep and goats. There should be pellets, or it should be pellets clumped together. That's good. Diarrhea is bad. So if it's coming out super loose or watery, that's bad. That's diarrhea or scouring. And we need to look at possible causes. Is the animal urinating normally? So this is especially important for males, but it's still important for females because they can get urinary tract infections, especially if they've been stressed, they've been off farm. Usually I see it myself as shows. So an animal's been stressed by either getting ready to go to the show, or it's at the show, it doesn't like the water, it's not drinking like it should, there's a lot of stuff happening. And then some of the females will present with a urinary tract infection. I've actually had to send my own niece's animal home because it had a UTI. But it's important for males and females, but it's critical with the males because if they're not urinating normally, then we want to look for an obstruction with them. So when you're looking at animals and you're trying to figure out what's going on with them, the first thing you probably should do is observe from a distance. Even if the animal is friendly, but especially if it's not a friendly animal, your presence, because they're a prey animal, is going to make them nervous. They may hide symptoms. They might get a rush of adrenaline that causes them to run off when they're lame and you don't notice what's going on with them. I mean, we chased down a lamb that was completely anemic and shouldn't be able to walk, but the adrenaline kicked in and we had to chase him down. So adrenaline can do a lot, especially when they're scared and you're around. So I suggest you observe from a distance first. You want to note any changes in behavior and any symptoms that you can see. So do they seem lethargic? Again, once a lethargic animal, once a person gets close to it and they're spooked, they might take off anyways. Are they straining? Do they seem like they're straining? So if they're straining, then there might be a urinary obstruction. You might see them limping and try to see which leg they're limping on that's causing them the problems from a distance first. Because again, if you walk up to them, especially if they're wild, they're going to take off. And you're not going to be able to tell which limb is causing them the problems. Another thing that you can look at too is a respiratory rate. You can do that from a distance. When I was working in a vet's office, when we had to go and do take their vitals every so often, the first thing I always did was get the respiratory rate before I opened up the kennel. And I usually did that kind of so they didn't see me, because even the friendly ones will start sniffing and doing stuff, and it's harder to hear and see that respiratory rate. So you can just observe that from a distance before you actually get your hands on the animal in a lot of cases. And then we're going to start assessing them for the less obvious thing. So you want to always start with the least invasive first. You don't want to go for the thermometer just yet. You don't want to start poking around on them right off the bat. You want to do the least invasive thing first. So with small ruminants, we always want to check their eyes. We want to get that FAMACHA score, make sure that they're nice and pink, and take note of, are they pale or are they nice and pink and they look good? You can also look for any injuries or signs of infection before you really start probing them. Look for any nasal discharge. And if you see a nasal discharge, note the color. And then check under the tail. So first look for diarrhea and see how bad it is. And then do the thing that everybody hates the most, is take the temperature. So the temperature can do two things for you. One, it's going to get you their temperature, which is very important. But also, if there's been no diarrhea noticeable, you can look for signs of it on the thermometer as well. Because a lot of times when their diarrhea is really, really, really bad and really watery, it's hard to notice, but you're still going to see evidence of it on the thermometer. Another little reminder, this presentation doesn't cover everything. We're hitting the big points today to get you comfortable with that. And as you're more comfortable with that, you have animals for a longer period of time, then you'll probably encounter some of the less common things. But this is going to get, the idea of this is to get you started, to get you comfortable, to get you to recognize something that is wrong so that it doesn't turn into a major emergency, or if it does, that your vet knows what's actually going on with the animal and can respond appropriately. All right, so some of the more obvious things that you may encounter, lameness will be one of them, and it can be quite common if you have animals long enough. So one of the things we're looking at when we're addressing lameness is it weight bearing? Is the animal actually putting weight on the limb that it's having problems with? So that can tell you a lot of things. If it's non-weight bearing, that's usually indicative of a broken bone, and that's very serious. Weight bearing could mean that it's just an injury. So, it could have gotten in a fight and gotten a horn and broke skin, or there could be an abscess. If a dog had been in there, it may have gotten bit and there's an injury that's turned into an infection. You want to, if it is weight bearing, or even if it's not, but you can't find that it really looks like, or you feel like it's not a broken bone, you do want to palpate the hoof, because abscesses can be hard to detect, especially in the hoof. So you want to check for any tenderness in the hoof. I was on a farm where I diagnosed foot scald, and I knew from the history that it was probably foot scald. Just wanted to see it, and it just sounded like a lot was going on there. But one of the animals was acting different. So we finally got a hold of it, and it had an abscess at the top of the hoof. So the other animals were dealing with scald, and this one actually had an abscess. So there was multiple things going on at the same time, which can throw you off. The goat in the picture actually had an old break. He was still not weight bearing on it. The vet x-rayed him. I saw where there was an old break, which I had braced myself. It was very, very minor. And it had healed over, but he still didn't want to use it. And she found evidence of possibly shot in him, like buckshot or something in him. Don't know how or why that happened. She suggested keeping his foot tucked up and wrapped so that it wasn't dangling down. She felt like that was stressing his whole leg. She wrapped it. It didn't last very long. She told me it wasn't going to last very long. So I went out and bought child shirts and knotted the sleeve on the leg that was supposed to be in a sling, basically. And that's what we did for a couple of weeks, and he got better. He got to be very colorful every day, but it did work. But that one was a hard one. Wouldn't have ever known what was wrong with him, and it may have never healed correctly if we didn't do an x-ray and figure out, because that was an odd case. One thing to note when you are seeing lameness, are multiple animals affected. So if you have a couple of animals that are affected, or a lot of animals that are affected, you want to look at things like foot scald or foot rot. And when you look at that, you're going to notice, you want to check the hooves, you want to check in between the two, toes and see if there's anything odd looking, like up in the skin. And then smell too. Smell can help you figure out what's going on. But usually when there's more than one, you've probably got some sort of bacteria traveling through your flock. And then have they been fighting or attacked? So if something has gotten in there, or you put like a new buck in there and they're fighting with everybody, then there could be injuries. So you want to look for areas that are swollen, any evidence of blood or wounds. Sometimes with, especially an animal that has a lot of hair or fleece, if you do see evidence of blood, then you may have to get out the clippers and shave it down to see what's actually going on. Because sometimes the hair and the wool can hide things really well. If the lameness is in young lambs and kids, especially less than a month, around that 7 to 10 day mark, you want to check for swelling or heat around the joint. Joint ill can be mistaken for broken bones. And then what you may see, but not always, is you might see that progress to more than one joint. So, for example, the goat in the picture that's laying down, I thought she'd been stepped on. She presented like she had a broken leg. I splinted it, and then the next day I brought her in the house because she couldn't stay out there, not able to walk on 3 legs. I brought her in the house, and then the next day she was lame on another leg. And then I noticed, oh, it's hot. Her joints are hot. She had joint ill. With broken bones, again, they usually are not going to want to put weight on the break. So if you see them really like trying to hop around on 3 limbs, then that is good evidence that the animal has a broken bone. You really need to get it checked out as soon as possible with the vet. One thing you want to do is make sure that you are careful not to let them further injure it and make it worse. And this can be hard, especially if they're not friendly and you're having to fight the animal. If you're palpating, you want to be very careful to palpate. The animal's usually going to react. So like if it's a limb, I start at the top and gradually palpate down till I can figure out where the injured area is. They usually will react, like they'll pull away, they may scream when you get to the injured area. If you can feel the break, it's bad. That goat had a broken leg right where I thought it was. I never actually felt the break in it. I just knew that she was painful in that area, and I splinted it until we got to the vet. But usually, so hers was not displaced. So it was broken, but everything was lined up, which made it easier for the vet to cast. Once you suspect a broken bone, the vet's going to need to x-ray it to see how bad it is. And also to make sure when they cast it that everything's lined up correctly. In this situation, if you suspect a break, you want to contact your vet immediately. And what they're usually going to do, depending on your level of expertise and where the break is, where you are, how long it's going to take you to get to the vet, they're probably going to advise you wrapping and stabilizing that injury until they can look at it and get it placed in a cast. We did go through that, I think, in Goat 911 Part 1. The very first week, we did go through how to actually properly wrap, especially extremities when there's a break, so to stabilize them so as to not further injure the animal. Lethargic animals are a little bit more difficult to diagnose or to figure out, sometimes even to notice. So usually, like I said, usually the mid-Atlantic area, the southern areas of the US, you want to check their eyes. And it's not a bad practice if there's anything wrong with your animal, or anytime in general you get your hands on your animal to check, go ahead and check its FOMACHA score and see if it's anemic or not. I'm pretty sure it's a sheep in the picture. As you can see, that animal really, they're not even pulling down on its eyelid, and you can already see how anemic it is. It's in the dangerous zone where if it's not treated immediately, it's definitely going to die. So you always want to check, and lethargy is one of the first symptoms you might notice especially if you're watching your animals closely when they have a severe barber pole infection. So you want to check to see if they're anemic, and then most likely that's going to be barber poles that need to be treated. But pneumonia is also a possibility. So if their FOMACHA score is good, then you want to get a temperature, check for a fever. Usually in this case, they're going to be off feed, and that's going to be the difference that you might notice without actually getting your hands on the animal is if they're lethargic and they're off feed, most likely they do have a fever. But again, these animals don't read books, so that's not 100% going to be the case most of the time. It will be, but you could have an animal that still eats through a fever. Diarrhea is one that you probably will encounter at some point if you have sheep and goats. So diarrhea is a symptom of a lot of different things. So I'm going to go over some of the possibilities that it could be. If they're still eating and acting fine, they could have just a mild case of it, or it could be a parasite possibly. So we want to go back to our FAMACHA training and see if we're going to treat them for a parasite. If they're young animals and there's been no change in their feed, maybe they are just starting to eat or you've weaned them, then we want to rule out something like coccidia because that's a big possibility in our younger animals. If you get a severe, sudden case of it, the animal goes off feed, it seems painful, just really looks like it feels like crap. Acidosis is a possibility, especially if they've gotten into feed or they've eaten more than normal. Maybe you took a couple of animals out, forgot, and gave them the usual ration, and one of your more dominant animals pigged out. So acidosis is a possibility. Also, overeating disease, enterotoxemia is another one that we want to keep on the radar. In both cases, these can be fatal. Sometimes you can self-treat, especially with the acidosis, but these are both dangerous things. If you have a sudden, very severe diarrhea, when the animals were out grazing, they didn't have access to grain. Only thing they went out in the field, they were grazing. Poisonous plants would be on my radar as a possible cause. And again, that would require veterinary attention. Another one that can be difficult to watch, but also difficult to diagnose are neurologic problems. So there's a couple of different ones. Sometimes these are so close that we treat for both. If they display either of the symptoms, we're going to treat for both diseases just to be on the safe side. So if you have an animal flopping on the ground, some people will say that it's mistake it for seizures. I know when I had a case of it years ago, my mom called me and told me my goat had been kicked in the head. And very, very severe neurologic symptoms. Usually they get very, very drunk and they just don't know. They try to get up, they fall over, they roll around. You want to check the eyes for something called nystagmus. And what nystagmus is, and it's sometimes hard to see until you've seen it in person and you know what you're looking at. But what nystagmus is you'll have to hold the animal's head still, but its eyes are going to dart back and forth. So that darting back and forth makes them very dizzy. So that's why they're flopping on the ground, because they're trying to regain their balance. They're just very dizzy. They don't know what's going on. So if you check for nystagmus, that's a good indication that the animal has polio. In the less severe cases of polio, you might just notice your animal kind of walking around seeming kind of drunk. In that case, I would still check for the nystagmus, but polio would be on my radar for that as well. Now, if you see your animal walking in circles, that's something that we kind of relate to both. Again, we would treat usually for both. The recommendation is to treat for both of these. And they can have both at the same time. But if they're walking in circles, that's listeriosis usually. And what happens is they just wander like in a circular pattern for no reason. They just wander. And I tell people it looks like the lights are on, but nobody's home. If you see that symptom, then if somebody calls me and they say the animal has that symptom, which the goat in that picture did have did have listeriosis, I'm going to start questioning what kind of feed it's had recently. So did it eat some feed that had gone bad? Has there been moldy hay? Something gotten wet, musty, anything out of the ordinary with its feed? Because it's usually what happens when they get it. We had a lot of cases of listeriosis around here a couple winters ago, and it was a very wet winter that we had, and everything, I think all the hay was getting moldy. So it just seemed like a lot of people were getting listeriosis. Now, something a little different that possibly could look the same would be some type of paralysis. So if you notice your animal exhibiting what you think might be paralysis, you want to rule out that it's not some sort of lameness, like an injury, something like that, because paralysis, depending on where you live, is usually going to be indicative of a meningeal worm. So if there's white-tailed deer around, then we want to tell the vet that there's a possibility of meningeal worm as soon as possible. The earlier stages of this are more of an ataxia. So what you might notice, and again, every animal may present differently. That is something we always have to keep in mind, especially with something like this, is they might present a little bit differently. Just because what I've seen with it, your animal might be a little bit different. Good case of that would be the listeriosis with my niece's goat. Typically, they present with a fever. Her goat presented with a low body temperature. So they don't always read the book. But the ataxia might just be like some swaying, like weak back legs. So again, this is where that age would be important, because if it's a lamb or a kid, the vet's going to be looking at different things than they are an adult animal presenting with that. That's out grazing. It is in areas where there might be snail mucus trails or slug mucus trails out in the pasture. So you might just first notice that it's kind of unstable. Maybe it walks a little drunk. That's how I would describe it, just weak in the hind end, just kind of swaying back and forth, because usually it will start, if it's starting in the legs, it's going to start in the rear, like you see the sheep in the picture, where it's paralyzed in the rear and just kind of legs are just kind of flop there. I will say that I have seen goats sit like this just because. So, you see your animal sitting like this, don't automatically assume it, just make it get up, and see if it walks the way normally. But the difference between this and what you might notice with like listeriosis is they're fully aware the lights are on, somebody's home, but they can't get to the door. Because that paralysis sometimes can be hard to detect. But when in doubt, either way, you would want a vet to get their hands on the animal as soon as possible so they can start checking it over and do a proper exam. When we're dealing with small ruminants, especially if you are in the area like the mid-Atlantic or southern areas where there's a lot of moisture, we always want to rule out parasites and check the temperature. If you can do nothing else, check for parasites. So check that thermometer score and get a temperature on that animal if you know to do nothing else. That's going to either rule out or diagnose the animal, because these are the big things that we're looking for when we have a sick small ruminant animal, sick sheep or goat, is we're going to look for parasites and we want to look at the temperature. Not to say that it can't have multiple things going on at the same time, especially when we're dealing with parasites. They can be highly parasitized and need to be dewormed and also have pneumonia at the same time. One thing that you can use, we talked about last week, was that 5-point check system. That is a good check system. One, to check for parasites, which is a big rule out for sheep and goats, but it also is going to check for some other things as well. So check their eyes, check their back for their body condition score, check for diarrhea, the coat condition, the jaw, check for a nasal discharge. So we can apply these to other things other than parasites. But again, we do want to look for, these are all important things for the vet to have. And if nothing else, you are ruling a couple of things out. Some things to remember: you are not a vet, so don't feel bad if you can't diagnose your own animal. That's what vets are for. They have a lot of schooling, they have a lot of experience. You can help them the best you can with good information. So again, if you can rule out a few things, it can help you build a good relationship with them. Keep in mind that your animals can hide symptoms. So if you know your animals, then you know what's normal and what's not normal for them. And then diseases can present differently in different animals. Again, like I said, with the listeriosis, typically would have a high temperature, but my experience with it, the goat had a low temperature. They do not read the books. And then a very important point is veterinarians are busy. They were busy before COVID, but now they seem to be even busier. I think there's been some people retiring, which has led to less available veterinarians in certain areas. So we always want to be mindful and use them the best way that we can and make sure we're not wasting their time. Um, because they're busy, when you call a vet's office, you may only get to speak with the receptionist. The staff is, if the vet's busy, the staff is usually busy too. And when having worked in a vet's office, when you're busy, you don't ask for extra information. If somebody calls in and says, well, my animal's lethargic, can I get it in? The receptionist is usually going to be like, oh, yeah, we could see it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow might be too late for the animal. So if you call in and say, my animal has a fever of 106, can I get it? Can I get it seen? Then they're going to know that it's an emergency. So the better information that you can offer to them without them having to pull it out of you, the better. And it's going to alert them that there is an emergency. And the more knowledgeable you sound and more certain you sound when you're talking, especially to a receptionist, they may, if nothing else, they will go and talk to the doctor about what you told them. That's been the case for me. I had a sheep with dystocia. I couldn't get the babies out, but the vet's office knew I had a lot of experience. So I had to throw some big words at the receptionist and like, I can't do this on my own. I know my limits. I cannot get these babies out on my own. I need to bring her in. Also, offering to bring the animal in up front may get you seen faster. So that is information that you want to go ahead and offer to the vet's office is, can I bring her in? Because a lot of times when you talk about livestock, they're going to assume that you need a farm visit, which is going to be harder to work into a schedule than bringing the animal to the office, especially if it's a mixed animal office. So make sure that you offer up as much information as possible to help them make an informed decision too about when it is appropriate to get you in and get the animal seen. And again, anytime if you have questions, you are welcome to contact me. If you are not in Maryland and you don't know who to contact within your state for extension and for more information, you can send that to me and I will try to get you in contact with someone who's closer to you. Always, I want you to contact the vet if you have an emergency. But you can, if you're uncertain and it's not, and maybe it's might be an urgency, but not an emergency yet, and you need help determining that, then I am always willing to answer questions. Not always a 24/7 service though. So it is always to alert your vet. If you're having problems getting up with your vet in the meantime, waiting for a call back, you can try to reach me and I will help you the best that I can. But hopefully we give you enough information that you are able to make these decisions and recognize this stuff in enough time that you have time to wait for that call back from your veterinarian.